this is C. Marshall with the first episode of Talking Backwards, a series of retrospective looks back at games. This will be on Freelancer, the space sim that was released in 2003. And I'll start this off with a question. Have games gotten easier as their popularity has increased? I don't know if easier is a fair word in this context. Maybe I should be asking if they've just gotten simpler. Better at avoiding the idea of letting you lose. Better at holding your hand. Just better at not letting the player play. After hearing Richard Hilleman, I think that's how you pronounce it, the chief creative officer of Electronic Arts, claiming their games are difficult, I started to think, because technology has certainly allowed for increasingly complex systems, physics interactions, player counts, extensive procedural generation, and so on. I just always considered them much more streamlined experiences when compared to older games, the ones I played as a child or even as a teenager. I would think of renting Body Harvest on the N64 and never getting past the first area, or being completely destroyed by Echo the Dolphin. And I would think about Freelancer, a game that my parents wouldn't let me install on their home computer, a game that I would just have to watch my cousin play. I would sit in disbelief, it just seemed impossibly complex. A living world behind the screen, packed with activities and trouble to find. That was over a decade ago now. Actually, in a few weeks, Freelancer will be celebrating its 12th birthday. And who would have thought space sim games are making a return with an almost unparalleled vigor. So amongst debating the purchase of Elite Dangerous or starting to invest time in Star Citizen, I made the responsible decision to hunt down my own copy of Freelancer and finally sink my teeth into this mythical game that had eluded my grasp for so long. And what I found was a flawed and remarkably simple game that I enjoyed quite a bit. Upon first booting it up, I was surprised at how well it had aged. The graphics would be below passable if they weren't elevated by the intense attention to detail. Everything seems thought out, with the look of the planets, ships, and things like trade lanes being validated by paragraphs of descriptive text and folklore. And it's also very good at telling stories without text or speaking at all, with things like massive metal graveyards littering certain areas, skeletal remains of once spectacular battleships being picked dry by scavengers. It's a sight to behold. And when your mind is immediately able to fill these blanks without much guidance, it brings an extra level of immersion and makes exploration without the guarantee of big rewards still rewarding. I haven't played many games that can match the feeling of leaving a dark cloud of ice or dust to be greeted by a massive planet or space station bustling with life. The world isn't intimidatingly large, it basically boils down to space versions of America, Britain, Germany, and Japan, each with a few solar systems scattered about them. But it's put together so well that even after a few dozen hours, the sense of place doesn't dissipate. The planets and space stations that you visit are varied in location and look, but all function the same. Each with at most 5 locations within them, a bar, an equipment dealer, a ship dealer, the commodities trader, and the launching pad. The bar is the place you go to mingle with some text boxes and get some missions or pay off your enemies. You do encounter some voice acting, but they're all pretty terrible, with a few exceptions as the main story is well acted enough. I love how some of the planet backdrops are done, all giving them a visual description of where you are. Even over a decade later, the environmental design is remarkable. The gameplay really doesn't match the level of the world though. Controlling the ship is beyond smooth, almost like a player-guided on-rail shooter, but combat never becomes varied or exciting enough to carry the game. The first battle plays out just like your last, even with the introduction of countermeasures, missiles, and so on. And even when you're like me, spending most of your time trading and smuggling resources, getting repeatedly ambushed gets really frustrating. The 4 automated flying options work flawlessly, and even if it can get a bit boring, it makes long trade missions so much more digestible, furthered by the hidden jump portals scattered about that help you trim some fat off your path. Most of the time you aren't controlling your ship, devolving into a point-and-click adventure game where you bounce from trade lane to jump gate, then rinse and repeat. Nevertheless, I can't act like I didn't enjoy playing around in the world. Seeking out hidden things by listening for clues or observing other ships' movement is great. The game wants to be explored. This exploration and just doing shit freely is the core fun of the game, and it's the biggest hook in Freelancer's arsenal. The back of the box even reads, "You decide," leading you to believe that a unique adventure will be built around your decisions. But for the first few hours, that just isn't the case at all because of the repetitive and deeply flawed story mode, which is required before the game lets you free to mess with the alliances and explore unabated. The story is deceptively simple, with a heavy backstory surrounding it and desperately trying to make things interesting. A huge problem is just how lousy the main character is, and you're stuck with him. It made me appreciate the silent protagonist, and it makes me understand how fucking hard it must be to write a playable character. I mean, you're running the risk of every spoken line being disagreed disagreed with on the other end, which also taught me a lot about why games like to focus on extremes with their characters, because extremes can function as a shield against harsh judgment. The main character is obnoxious, zany, self-referential, strong-willed, and so on, because even if the player disagrees with the protagonist, you can at least have fun doing it. Here, the protagonist Trent is this bland guy being dragged around space and getting into unwanted trouble. The missions themselves are painfully elementary, a series of point A to point B quests that almost always get ambushed. The fucking ambushes never stop, and you're almost always in a hurry, being pursued or pressured to move, even though I would want to stop and poke around these places I was blazing through. In one of the menus, you can see this list of alliance meters, which are irrelevant throughout the entire campaign. They just sit and tempt you with freedom yet unseen, and the save points can be brutally sparse, leading you to retrace large empty spaces to get back to the action. So for a little while, I really hated this game, before finding out that you were let free after the completion of the campaign. So the entire time, I was just begging to be able to do my own thing, beyond the intermission periods between missions where half the galaxy is upset with you. Good mission design should never leave the player just praying for them to end, and this is the game's deepest wound for me, and the moment where the brutal development process is the most apparent. The game went through a ton of major changes before its release, and you can tell when playing through these quests. It was an MMO, it was an on-rails shooter, it was in development for over half a decade, and after building such an incredible world, the missions feel wrong, even to the point where they betray some of the game's most enticing portions, like the aforementioned allegiances and just the natural exploration. As you play through the game, you run past countless ideas and set pieces that are never tied into the gameplay properly, a series of vestigial organs. But the moment you are done with the story, the game is aimless bliss, finally giving you the opportunity to set out and get more number, fight whoever you want, and side with whoever you want, even though the actual execution of this is shallow. But there are enough combined elements to keep it really fun. I love how you can ignore entire fleshed out systems without much consequences. You never have to trade or pay off your enemies or find the secret jump gates, but they're there if you want to explore. Making your way in a galaxy built this well is just a winning formula. Traveling between things is just short and visually stimulating enough to stay interesting. I enjoyed making long trades and cashing them in for wild amounts of money. The trading is far too simple and it never changes, which can almost feel like cheating sometimes, but it's nice and relaxing even though I would have loved some market fluctuations. As I made more and more money though, I hated not having my own garage, or any place to store my ships at all. It was seriously upsetting having to get rid of a prized freighter to get a combat ship to kill some things. The freighters are loaded down with weapons, but pretty terrible at fighting, and it also never really gives you a place to call home. I wouldn't mind having to cross the galaxy to change ships if I at least had the option to buy a garage or at least a dock within a certain station. It's a strange design decision. Purchasing these ships, navigating the galaxy, and generally fucking around is made better by how well the UI is designed. It's legitimately wonderful. A consistent and descriptive, almost to a fault, series of text-filled menus. The navigation of the map feels aged and slow, but there is so much information given that I can't be upset. When planning a route to smuggle some supplies, you can work around the areas that aren't happy with you. The map and menu design is something that today's open world games could take some notes from, especially when looking at the maps of something like Far Cry or Assassin's Creed. Overstuffed, labyrinthine, and with far too few sorting options, like the developers are actively working to make things harder. Freelancer's menu design is comparatively superb. Setting a ship into auto drive and reading about the location you're in is more than pleasant, and it's marvelous how some of the on-screen HUD can be minimized with the click of a button. I had some huge problems with this game. Even though I feel like a son of a bitch talking garbage about a video game that's almost a teenager, some of the things done here are just not enjoyable. Freelancer does some things better than even most games coming out today, and its successes match its failures to a disturbing parody, and I definitely understand how it's achieved its legendary status because playing the game feels remarkably captivating. The chatter of the passing ships, the sighting of a brilliant new planet, and pulling out of a station in a brand new ship. The game can bring about this zen-like state, forcing almost a trucker's mindset, and it's done with such love and care for the material, but its blemishes are apparent, and the consequence of the developer's ambitious triumphs and failures. And in the end, I guess my biggest problem with Freelancer, beyond the lack of freedom in the beginning, was just how much it teased me. It spawned a craving that it never really satiated. It's still such an experience because of how lost in time it feels. So forward-thinking in some elements, and so many more feel obsolete. It's funny how much the mind changes, though. What once stood before me, a wildly complex game being played by my older cousin, now seems so flaccid. But looking at past games with today's cynical viewpoint doesn't feel right, because the game is fun by any day's standards, and I guess gaming hasn't changed as much as I have in the past decade. Things are still overhyped till their milk runs dry, and developers still can't help but overpromise. But on the player's side, fun sometimes doesn't fall into your lap, and it's ridiculous to hold any sort of failing from an entertainment product as any sort of offense against you. I honestly didn't like Freelancer as much as I hoped, but I certainly had a good time. It wasn't an acquired taste for me as much as it just took some work for me to fit into the shoes it provided, which is getting harder and harder as I keep getting older and older. Here's to the future, I guess. Thank you so much for watching.